The porcelain cup shattered against the kitchen floor like a gunshot. Earl Grey tea spreading across worn wooden planks in patterns that resembled bloodstains. Mrs. Catherine Beaumont convulsed once, twice, then lay still beside the fragments of her morning ritual. This is the story of how one enslaved girl turned a Mississippi plantation into a battlefield using nothing more than foxglove leaves and raw courage. The Beaumont plantation sprawled across 2,000 acres of prime cotton land overlooking the Mississippi River just south of Vicksburg in the sweltering summer of 1857. The big house sat like a crown jewel atop rolling hills, its white columns gleaming in the morning sun, while Spanish moss draped the ancient oaks like funeral shrouds. But beneath the veneer of Southern gentility lurked something poisonous, a system built on human misery that was about to meet its match in a 16-year-old kitchen servant named Amara. From the Warren County Records, July 15, 1857. Property inventory includes 43 field hands, 12 house servants, valued at $37,000 total. Amara had been born into bondage on the Beaumont estate, her mother dying in childbirth, leaving her to be raised by the other kitchen workers. She possessed an unusual combination of intelligence and invisibility, smart enough to memorize every conversation she overheard while appearing simple enough that white folks spoke freely around her. Her dark eyes missed nothing, cataloging cruelties and storing grievances like a ledger of unpaid debts. The morning of July 20th began like any other. The grandfather clock in the main hall chimed 6 times, while morning mist rose from the river like ghosts seeking redemption. In the kitchen, cast iron pots bubbled over wood-burning stoves, filling the air with the scent of cornbread and bacon grease. Amara's bare feet made no sound against the cypress flooring as she prepared Mrs. Beaumont's morning tea, a ritual as sacred as Sunday service in the Beaumont household, but this morning carried the metallic tang of foxglove. Catherine Beaumont prided herself on running a Christian household, which in her twisted logic meant reading Bible verses while having servants whipped for minor infractions. She sat at her mahogany writing desk that morning, composing letters to relatives in Charleston about the upcoming harvest festivities, unaware that her trusted kitchen girl was measuring death into her favorite Wedgwood teacup. Amara had learned about plant poisons from old Nana, the plantation's herb woman who treated both human and livestock ailments with remedies passed down through generations. Foxglove was particularly useful. Beautiful purple flowers that could slow a racing heart or stop it entirely, depending on the dose. Amara had been collecting the leaves for weeks, drying them in a hidden spot beneath the smokehouse where no one would think to look. The signal was simple. When Mrs. Beaumont drank her poison tea, Amara would step onto the back porch and ring the dinner bell 3 times, an unusual pattern that would carry across the fields to where the field hands toiled under the merciless Mississippi Sunday. Mrs. Beaumont took her first sip at precisely 7:45 a.m., then another. The digitalis worked faster than Amara had expected, attacking the woman's heart with chemical precision. Within minutes, Catherine Beaumont was gasping for air, her face flushing purple as her pulse became erratic. The teacup slipped from her trembling fingers. Poison was just the beginning. Amara watched from the doorway as her mistress collapsed, feeling neither satisfaction nor remorse, only the cold certainty that justice had finally found its way to the Beaumont plantation. She stepped onto the porch and rang that bell 3 times, the sound echoing across cotton fields like a declaration of war. But here's what the historical record doesn't capture about that moment. Where were you sitting when you first realized that everything you'd been taught about power was wrong? Where are you watching from right now, and what time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happened next would transform a simple poisoning into something far more terrifying. A coordinated uprising that would shake the foundations of the antebellum South. In the fields, 43 enslaved workers heard that bell and knew exactly what it meant. They had been planning this moment for months, meeting in secret during the brief windows between sunset and exhaustion. Tonight, they would either die as rebels or live as something the South had never seen before: free. What happens when the powerless decide they've had enough of being powerless? When kitchen servants become generals and field hands become soldiers? The answer lay waiting in the darkness, where torches would soon illuminate the true cost of centuries of unpaid labor. Because Catherine Beaumont's death was just the spark, the real fire was about to begin. The dinner bell's third chime died in the humid air like a held breath finally released. Across the plantation, 43 pairs of eyes lifted from cotton plants, hoes, and tobacco leaves. The coordinated response that followed would prove that enslaved people had been organizing resistance far more sophisticated than their oppressors ever imagined. The fields stretched endlessly under the July sun, rows of cotton plants creating natural corridors where whispered conversations could travel unseen. The soil beneath bare feet still held the morning's moisture, muffling footsteps as field hands began their carefully rehearsed movements. The air hung thick with the green smell of growing things and the salt of human sweat, a combination that would soon mix with smoke and fear. Josiah, the plantation's head field hand, had been expecting this signal for weeks. At 35, he possessed the kind of quiet authority that came from surviving 2 decades of bondage without losing either his mind or his hope. When that bell rang its unusual pattern, he didn't pause in his cotton picking. Such an obvious reaction would alert the 3 white overseers scattered across the vast acreage. Instead, he began humming an old spiritual, one whose lyrics had been modified to carry tactical information. "Wade in the water, children," he sang softly, his deep voice carrying across the rows. But the workers who heard him understood the real message. Positions were to be taken, weapons retrieved, and the final phase of their months-long preparation activated. From a plantation overseer's journal, July 20th, 1857, the Negroes seemed unusually restless today. Several work songs heard that I did not recognize, made note to discuss with Mr. Beaumont. The planning had begun 6 months earlier, when Amara first approached Josiah with her dangerous proposition. She had observed the cruelties of the big house, while he had witnessed the brutalities of the fields, a combination of intelligence that proved lethal to the status quo. Together, they had mapped out every building, counted every weapon, identified every potential ally and enemy. Most importantly, they had studied the habits of their oppressors with the attention to detail that could mean the difference between freedom and the gallows. The arsenal they had assembled was hidden in plain sight: farming tools that could become weapons, kitchen knives that could cut more than vegetables, and most crucially, the knowledge of how to coordinate their actions across the vast plantation grounds. They had learned from the failed rebellions of the past Denmark Vesey's conspiracy in Charleston, Nat Turner's revolt in Virginia, understanding that success required not just courage, but careful timing and overwhelming force. As Josiah's spiritual continued, other field hands began their own preparations. Sarah, who worked in the vegetable gardens, slipped away to retrieve the cache of sharpened hoes and scythes hidden beneath the tool shed. Marcus, the blacksmith's apprentice, made his way toward the forge, where iron implements could be turned into instruments of revolution. Each movement appeared casual, part of the normal rhythm of plantation life, but together they formed a deadly choreography. The uprising had been years in the making, but here was the genius of their strategy. They understood that white overseers, despite their brutality, had become complacent. The daily violence of slavery had created a false sense of security among the oppressors, who believed that their victims were too broken, too isolated, too afraid to organize meaningful resistance. This blindness would prove fatal. The 3 overseers, Thompson, Bradley, and young Peterson, continued their lazy supervision, occasionally shouting commands or threats, but generally seeking shade during the hottest part of the day. Thompson, the most experienced, had noticed the unusual singing, but attributed it to the Negroes' strange religious customs. Bradley was half drunk by noon, as usual. Peterson, barely 21 and new to the job, was more interested in impressing the slave women than maintaining proper vigilance. What none of them realized was that they were being systematically isolated. As the afternoon wore on, the field hands gradually repositioned themselves. Work groups that normally stayed in their assigned sections began to drift, creating gaps in coverage that forced the overseers to spread out further. By 4 o'clock, each white man found himself alone with increasingly large groups of enslaved workers, the normal ratio of control dangerously inverted. The sun began its descent toward the Mississippi River, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson that would soon be matched by flames. In the big house, servants went about their usual duties, while their mistress lay dead in her study, the foxglove having done its work with chemical precision. But the house slaves were not idle. They were gathering intelligence, securing weapons, and preparing for the chaos that would begin with darkness. How long can a system built on violence maintain itself when its victims decide to embrace violence in return? How many generations of unpaid labor does it take before the debt comes due with interest? These questions would be answered in blood and fire before the night was through. Because, as the sun set over the Beaumont plantation, 43 enslaved people were about to discover what it felt like to hold power in their own hands, and their oppressors were about to learn the true cost of centuries of cruelty. The grandfather clock struck 9 times as the last traces of daylight bled from the Mississippi sky. In the slave quarters, oil lamps flickered like fireflies against the growing darkness. Tonight, shadows would hide the largest coordinated uprising in Warren County history. The quarters consisted of 12 wooden cabins arranged in 2 neat rows, their thin walls barely containing the whispered prayers and nervous energy of 43 people preparing for war. The smell of cornbread and fatback lingered in the evening air, mixing with the earthy scent of the Mississippi River bottom and the metallic tang of freshly sharpened steel. Bare wooden floors creaked under careful footsteps as final preparations were made in near-total silence. Amara moved between the cabins like a general inspecting troops. Her slight frame belied the authority she had assumed since poisoning Mrs. Beaumont that morning. The other enslaved people, many twice her age and size, deferred to her tactical intelligence and icy determination. She carried no weapon yet, but her knowledge of the big house layout and the habits of its occupants made her invaluable. From a letter found in the Warren County Courthouse, dated July 21, 1857. The coordination displayed suggests months of planning. The rebels possessed detailed knowledge of guard rotations, weapon locations, and escape routes. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. 3 teams would strike simultaneously at different targets: the big house, the overseer quarters, and the plantation's armory. Each group had specific objectives and backup plans, contingencies developed through months of careful observation and whispered discussions during the brief windows of unsupervised time. Josiah commanded the largest force, 25 field hands, who would overwhelm the overseer quarters, where Thompson, Bradley, and Peterson slept off their daily whiskey consumption. Sarah led 12 house servants in seizing the big house, using their intimate knowledge of every room and passage to move like ghosts through familiar territory. Amara herself would guide 6 of the strongest men to the locked building where Mr. Beaumont stored rifles, ammunition, and the tools of oppression. The beauty of their timing lay in exploiting the plantation's most vulnerable hour. The White family had retired early. Mr. Beaumont to his study with a bottle of bourbon, his 2 adult sons to their respective rooms after a day of gambling and drinking. The overseers, exhausted from the heat and their own vices, would be deep in alcohol-induced slumber. Only the house servants remained active, cleaning up after their master's evening meal. But the servants were no longer serving their masters. As 10 o'clock approached, the first phase began with deadly precision. Sarah's team entered the big house through the kitchen door, their bare feet silent on polished hardwood floors. They moved like water through rooms they had cleaned thousands of times, each person knowing exactly where to step to avoid creaking boards, which doors opened smoothly, and where the family members were most likely to be found. Marcus, the blacksmith's apprentice, led the assault on the overseer quarters. The 3 buildings sat in a neat line 50 yards from the main house, designed to provide supervision while maintaining the fiction of white superiority. Tonight, that separation would prove fatal for their occupants. Freedom demanded payment in blood. The first screams came from the overseer quarters at 10:15 p.m. Thompson had awakened to find 6 enslaved men standing over his bed, farm tools glinting in the lamplight. His shouts for help died quickly, muffled by hands that had spent years obeying his commands and were now determined to silence them forever. Bradley's cabin erupted in violence moments later. The overseer, still drunk from his evening consumption, stumbled from his bed, only to meet the business end of a cotton hoe wielded by a man whose back bore scars from Bradley's whip. The irony was not lost on anyone. Tools designed to work the land now liberated those who had worked it. Young Peterson proved more troublesome. Alert enough to recognize the danger, he barricaded himself in his cabin and began firing through the window with a pistol he kept beside his bed. His shots rang out across the plantation like alarm bells, alerting the main house that something had gone terribly wrong. In the big house, Amara's team heard the gunfire and accelerated their timeline. They burst through doors with the fury of people who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Mr. Beaumont, roused by the commotion, stumbled from his study to find his household in chaos. His own servants, people he had considered property, now held kitchen knives and carpenter's tools with clear intent. The plantation's careful hierarchy collapsed in minutes. White authority, built on violence and fear, crumbled when faced with organized resistance from people who had been systematically underestimated. The enslaved workers discovered something their oppressors had always known but never acknowledged. Violence was indeed the foundation of power, and it could flow in either direction. What happens when the powerless realize that power was never about deserving it, but about taking it? When kitchen knives become symbols of revolution and work songs become battle hymns, the Beaumont plantation was about to provide those answers in the starkest possible terms. Because as the night deepened and the violence spread, 43 enslaved people were discovering that freedom was not something to be granted. It was something to be seized with both hands, regardless of the cost. Orange flames licked the night sky like the tongues of vengeful spirits, casting dancing shadows across the manicured grounds of the Beaumont estate. The mansion that had stood as a symbol of white supremacy for 3 generations was now becoming its funeral pyre. This was the moment when property became people, and people became revolutionaries. The fire had started in the library, where leather-bound volumes chronicling 3 centuries of human bondage fed the flames with particular enthusiasm. The smell of burning paper mixed with the acrid smoke of melting chandelier crystal and charring hardwood floors. Ancient Persian rugs, purchased with profits from human misery, curled and blackened as the heat intensified. The grandfather clock, that steady timekeeper of oppression, melted into a surreal sculpture of twisted metal and broken promises. Amara stood in the main hallway watching her childhood prison transform into an inferno. The walls that had contained her entire world for 16 years now blazed with liberation. Portraits of Beaumont ancestors, men and women who had built their fortune on the backs of the enslaved, cracked and peeled in the heat, their painted faces contorting into expressions of horror that matched their descendants' final moments. From the Vicksburg Daily Whig, July 22, 1857. The conflagration could be seen from the river, casting an orange glow visible for miles. Steamboat passengers reported the sky appeared to be bleeding. The coordination continued, even as chaos reigned. While the main house burned, Josiah's team had successfully captured the plantation's arsenal, a brick building that Mr. Beaumont had considered impregnable. Years of observing their masters had taught the enslaved workers every detail of daily routines, including where keys were kept and when guards changed shifts. The lock that had secured the weapons proved less formidable than the determination of people who had finally decided to be free. Inside the armory, they discovered 12 rifles, countless rounds of ammunition, and something even more valuable: documents. Bills of sale, breeding records, punishment logs, the entire bureaucratic machinery of human bondage laid out in meticulous detail. These papers represented not just legal proof of ownership, but a systematic record of how people had been reduced to property, families torn apart, and children sold like livestock. The documents burned almost as eagerly as the mansion, but the night's violence was not without its terrible cost. 3 of the rebels had fallen during the assault on Peterson's cabin, shot down as they tried to flush out the young overseer, who had proven surprisingly resourceful in his desperation. Their names were Samuel, Isaac, and young Mercy. Barely 14, but old enough to understand that freedom was worth dying for. Their bodies lay still in the Mississippi dirt, the first casualties of a war that had been raging in whispers for generations. This was the price of paradise lost. The surviving revolutionaries gathered in the plantation's courtyard as the big house collapsed into itself with a roar like thunder. 40 people stood bathed in firelight, their faces reflecting both triumph and terror. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, from property to people, from slaves to rebels, from victims to victors. But they had also signed their own death warrants in a society that would never forgive this transgression. Amara climbed onto an overturned cotton wagon to address her fellow rebels. At 16, she possessed the kind of authority that comes from successfully leading people through impossible circumstances. Her voice carried clearly over the crackling flames and settling rubble. "We are no longer slaves," she declared, her words cutting through the smoke and chaos. "Tonight we chose to live as free people, or die as free people. But we will never again bow to masters who think they own our souls." The cheers that followed could be heard across the river in Louisiana. Yet even in their moment of triumph, the practical realities of rebellion pressed upon them. They had perhaps hours before the outside world discovered what had happened at the Beaumont plantation. White militias would be mobilized, bloodhounds would be brought in, and the full weight of Mississippi's racial hierarchy would descend upon them with lethal force. Freedom, they were learning, was easier to seize than to keep. The question that haunted their celebration was simple. What does victory look like when the entire world is against you? When burning down one plantation only alerts every other plantation owner to tighten their grip? When the taste of freedom comes with the knowledge that it might last only until dawn? Amara had an answer, but it would require something even more dangerous than what they had already accomplished. It would require them to disappear entirely, to become ghosts in a world that was already hunting them. The fire behind them was dying down, but their real journey toward freedom was just beginning. Because 40 free black people in Mississippi represented something the South had never seen before, and something it would kill to prevent from spreading. Bloodhounds bayed in the distance like demons calling for vengeance as the sun rose over the smoldering ruins of the Beaumont plantation. Steam hissed from the blackened foundation stones, where morning dew met the residual heat of revolution. By sunrise, 3 militias and the Warren County Sheriff's posse were closing in on 40 people who had committed the unthinkable crime of choosing freedom. The morning air carried the acrid smell of wet ash and burned dreams, mixing with the earthy scent of Mississippi River bottom and the metallic tang of blood that had soaked into the plantation soil. Wisps of smoke still rose from the mansion's ruins, like the ghosts of 3 generations of Beaumont tyranny finally released from their earthly bonds. In the distance, Church bells from Vicksburg tolled 7 times, marking the beginning of a day that would transform Warren County forever. Colonel Marcus Webb of the county militia had received word of the uprising at 5:30 a.m. via a frantic messenger who had ridden hard from a neighboring plantation. The man had seen the glow on the horizon and investigated, discovering a scene that challenged everything white Mississippi believed about the docility of their human property. His report was brief but terrifying. Total insurrection. All whites dead. Negroes armed and organized. From the Warren County Sheriff's Department records. July 21st, 1857. Mobilized all available men. Governor notified. Bloodhounds requested from Jackson. Reward posted. $100 per rebel, dead or alive. The manhunt that followed represented the largest mobilization of white force in Mississippi since the Nat Turner Rebellion 26 years earlier. Colonel Webb commanded 60 militiamen, armed with rifles and driven by fear that the uprising might spread to other plantations. Sheriff Harrison brought his regular posse of 25 men, supplemented by volunteers who saw opportunity in the substantial bounties being offered. Most ominously, professional slave catchers arrived from across the state, men who specialized in tracking human beings with the same efficiency others used to hunt animals. But Amara had anticipated this response. The rebels had not fled randomly into the Mississippi wilderness. Instead, they had split into carefully planned groups, following routes that Amara had been mapping for months during her rare trips beyond the plantation boundaries. Her intelligence network, built through conversations with traveling peddlers, visiting servants, and the occasional free black person who passed through the area, had provided detailed knowledge of terrain, safe houses, and potential allies. The largest group, 30 people led by Josiah, headed northwest toward the Yazoo River basin where dense swampland would make tracking difficult. They carried the weapons captured from the plantation armory and enough supplies to survive several days in hostile territory. Their goal was to reach the underground railroad stations that Amara had identified through months of careful listening and observation. A smaller group of 6, led by Sarah, moved southeast toward Natchez, where the urban environment might provide opportunities to blend in among the city's substantial free black population. They traveled light, but carried something potentially more valuable than weapons: the plantation's account books and legal documents, evidence that could expose the financial networks underlying the slave economy. Amara herself led the most dangerous mission. With 3 companions, she moved directly toward Vicksburg, into the heart of Confederate power, where bounty hunters would least expect to find her. Her destination was a steamboat landing, where she planned to accomplish something unprecedented: escape by hiding in plain sight aboard a vessel that would carry her beyond the reach of Mississippi justice. But freedom demanded its own sacrifices. The pursuit began within hours of dawn. Colonel Webb's militiamen followed the most obvious trail, the path taken by Josiah's large group, while Sheriff Harrison's posse split up to cover multiple directions. The bloodhounds, arriving from Jackson by special train, immediately caught scent trails that led in 3 different directions, confirming what the authorities feared most. This had been a coordinated operation, with predetermined escape routes. The first contact came at noon when militiamen caught up with 2 stragglers from Josiah's group elderly field hands who had fallen behind despite their companions' efforts to maintain group cohesion. The encounter was brief and brutal. When the shooting stopped, 2 more bodies lay in the Mississippi dirt, and Colonel Webb had confirmation that the rebels were indeed armed and willing to fight. The discovery sent shockwaves through the white community. These were not panicked fugitives fleeing in terror. They were organized revolutionaries prepared to kill and die for their freedom. The implications terrified plantation owners across the region, who began to see potential rebellion in every sideways glance from their own enslaved workers. Meanwhile, the net was tightening around all 3 groups. Telegraph lines carried descriptions across multiple states, and rewards increased hourly as fear transformed into fury. The governor had declared martial law in Warren County, suspended habeas corpus, and authorized the use of any force necessary to capture the rebels. But where was Amara? The bloodhounds had lost her scent at a creek crossing 5 miles from the plantation, and she seemed to have vanished like smoke. Some militiamen whispered that she had indeed transformed into something more than human, a spirit of vengeance that could slip between raindrops and become invisible at will. The truth was both simpler and more complex. Amara had not become supernatural, but she had become something equally dangerous in the antebellum South, an intelligent black woman who refused to accept the limitations that society had placed upon her. And she was heading directly toward the one place where her pursuers would never think to look for a fugitive slave: the elegant parlors and grand ballrooms of Vicksburg high society. The paddle-wheeler Mississippi Belle churned through brown river water like a floating palace, its twin smokestacks belching black clouds into the humid afternoon air. Music and laughter drifted from the upper decks, where white passengers celebrated another profitable cotton season. Hidden among the cargo and livestock below, Amara was learning that sometimes the best place to disappear is in the heart of enemy territory. The steamboat's lower deck reeked of coal smoke, animal waste, and human sweat, a sensory assault that made breathing feel like drowning in thick molasses. Bales of cotton towered like fortress walls, creating narrow passages where a small person could move unseen. The constant vibration of the paddle wheel against river current provided cover for any sounds of movement, while the ship's busy crew was too focused on navigation and cargo management to notice one additional shadow among many. Amara had reached the Vicksburg landing by following drainage ditches and abandoned roads, traveling only at night and hiding during daylight hours. Her knowledge of local geography, gained through years of listening to travelers' conversations in the Beaumont kitchen, had proven invaluable. She knew which routes would be watched and which forgotten paths might provide safe passage. From the Steamboat Manifest, July 21, 1857. Cargo includes 400 bales, prime cotton, livestock, machinery, passengers, 47 white, 12 free, colored with papers. The disguise that had carried her this far was elegant in its simplicity. She had adopted the role of a free colored servant, traveling with the wealthy Thornton family of New Orleans, a fiction supported by forged papers created during the planning phase of the rebellion. The documents identified her as Celia, a lady's maid with permission to travel unaccompanied on her mistress's business. Such arrangements were common enough that they rarely drew scrutiny, especially when the supposed servant appeared properly deferential and well-dressed. The clothing had been stolen from Mrs. Beaumont's wardrobe during the previous night's chaos, a traveling dress of dark wool that conveyed respectability without ostentation. Amara had practiced the mannerisms required for her deception, observing how free-colored people moved through white spaces with careful dignity, alert but not fearful, respectful but not servile. But maintaining the disguise required constant vigilance. Every interaction carried the potential for exposure. Every conversation might contain a trap. She had to navigate the complex social hierarchies of the steamboat white passengers who expected deference, free colored people who might be suspicious of a stranger, and crew members who asked too many questions. Freedom was a performance she could not afford to break. The greatest danger came from an unexpected source: another passenger's genuine kindness. Mrs. Elizabeth Morrison, a New Orleans society matron traveling with her own servants, had noticed Celia and attempted to engage her in conversation about mutual acquaintances in the Crescent City. The questions were innocent but potentially fatal. Amara had never been to New Orleans and knew nothing of its free-colored society beyond what she had overheard in kitchen conversations. "Your mistress mentioned you were from the French Quarter, Mrs." Morrison continued, her fan fluttering against the July heat. "Which church does your family attend? I'm always curious about the colored congregations there." Amara's mind raced through every overheard conversation, every scrap of information she had gathered about New Orleans during her years of invisible observation. "Street Augustine, ma'am," she replied, remembering a visiting priest who had mentioned celebrating Mass there for the free-colored community. "Though I fear I'm not as faithful as my dear mother would wish." The answer satisfied Mrs. Morrison, who launched into her own opinions about religious devotion among the servant class. But the close call reminded Amara that her freedom depended not just on her disguise, but on her ability to think quickly under pressure, a skill developed through 16 years of surviving in a world designed to destroy her. Meanwhile, the steamboat carried news of the uprising along with its human cargo. Passengers discussed the rebellion in hushed tones, their conversations a mixture of horror and fascination. "A plantation burned," they whispered. "All the whites murdered. Armed Negroes loose in Warren County. The governor had called out the militia. Bloodhounds were tracking the fugitives, and massive rewards had been posted." Listening to these conversations from her shadowy hiding place among the cotton bales, Amara learned that 2 of her companions had been captured and killed, resisting arrest. Josiah's group was surrounded but still fighting in the Yazoo River swampland. Sarah's smaller team had vanished entirely, their fate unknown. The manhunt was expanding across 3 states, with every law enforcement agency and slave patrol in the region mobilized for the largest fugitive hunt in Southern history. But here she was, floating past the very militiamen who sought her, invisible in plain sight, aboard a steamboat filled with the enemy. The irony was not lost on her. She was using the South's own transportation networks and social hierarchies to escape the consequences of challenging those same systems. As the Mississippi Belle approached Natchez, Amara faced her next crucial decision. She could disembark here and attempt to disappear among the city's free-colored population, following Sarah's original plan. Or she could remain aboard as the steamboat continued toward New Orleans, where the larger population might provide better opportunities for permanent concealment. Either choice carried enormous risks, but staying aboard meant spending another night surrounded by enemies, maintaining her performance while her fellow rebels were being hunted down like animals across the Mississippi wilderness. The paddle wheel churned onward through brown water, carrying Amara toward a future that remained as uncertain as the river's murky depths. Behind her, smoke still rose from the ruins of the only home she had ever known. Ahead lay possibilities she had never dared imagine, freedom in a world that had never intended for her to be free. Spanish moss draped the ancient oaks like funeral shrouds as the Mississippi Belle docked at the New Orleans levee, its paddle wheel finally silent after 2 days of carrying secrets downstream. The Crescent City spread before Amara like a promise wrapped in danger. But freedom in 1857 New Orleans meant navigating a social labyrinth where one wrong step could mean death, or worse, a return to bondage. The levee hummed with activity that assaulted all senses. Simultaneously, Irish stevedores shouting in brogues, thick as river mud, the sweet smell of sugarcane mixing with the rot of fish markets, and the feel of sticky cobblestones beneath thin-soled shoes stolen from a dead woman's wardrobe. Steamboats lined the waterfront like sleeping giants, their smokestacks creating a forest of iron against the muggy sky. The air tasted of salt and possibility, tinged with the ever-present reminder that even in this cosmopolitan port, slavery remained the foundation upon which prosperity was built. Amara disembarked as Celia for the final time, her forged papers having carried her through 3 inspections during the journey downstream. She moved with the practiced invisibility that had served her throughout 16 years of bondage, but now that skill served liberation rather than survival. Behind her, the Mississippi Belle prepared for its return journey upstream, carrying news of the Warren County uprising to every landing along the river. From the New Orleans Daily Picayune, July 24, 1857. Reports continued to arrive of the unprecedented insurrection at the Beaumont plantation. Authorities maintain that all rebels will be captured, but some escaped slaves are believed to have reached the city's free-colored quarter. The free-colored community of New Orleans represented something unique in the antebellum South, a third category between slavery and white supremacy, where people of African descent could own property, operate businesses, and move through society with relative freedom. But this liberty came with its own constraints and dangers. Free papers could be challenged, questioned, or simply ignored by authorities seeking to expand the enslaved population through legal fiction. Amara spent her first 3 days in the city learning its rhythms and hierarchies. She observed how free-colored people moved through white spaces, confident but not defiant, prosperous but not ostentatious, always aware that their freedom was conditional rather than guaranteed. She studied their clothing, their mannerisms, their careful navigation of social boundaries that could mean the difference between liberty and bondage. Her temporary sanctuary was a boarding house in the Faubourg Marigny, operated by Madame Celeste, a free woman of color who asked few questions and accepted payment in advance. The establishment catered to travelers whose documentation might not withstand close scrutiny, merchants avoiding taxes, escaped debtors seeking fresh starts, and occasionally fugitives from various forms of justice. But Amara's respite was shattered on her 4th morning when she recognized a face from her nightmares. Marcus Bradley Jr., son of the overseer who had died in the uprising, stood on the boarding house's front steps with 2 companions and a sheaf of wanted posters. His presence in New Orleans could mean only one thing: the manhunt had followed her downstream. The past refused to stay buried. Bradley's investigation had been thorough and methodical. Working backward from the steamboat manifests, he had identified suspicious passengers who might have been traveling under false documentation. The Celia identity had not withstood professional scrutiny. No Thornton family in New Orleans employed a maid by that name, and the forged papers contained subtle errors that trained eyes could detect. Amara watched from her 2nd-floor window as Bradley questioned Madame Celeste, who maintained perfect ignorance while counting the bribes that would ensure her continued discretion. But the net was tightening around all suspected fugitives in the free-colored quarter. House-to-house searches would begin within hours, and even the most convincing false identity would not survive determined investigation. That night, Amara made a decision that transformed her from fugitive to legend. Instead of continuing to run, she chose to disappear in the most permanent way possible, by becoming someone else entirely, someone who had never been enslaved, never participated in rebellion, never existed before that moment. She burned her forged papers, along with every physical reminder of her former life, including the blood-stained dress stolen from Mrs. Beaumont's wardrobe. From that point forward, she was Marie Laveau, a name chosen to honor the legendary voodoo priestess while claiming an identity that belonged to no one and everyone. She adopted the mannerisms of a Creole woman born free, created a history that included birth records lost in a convenient fire, and began practicing the folk magic that would make her invaluable to a community that valued spiritual protection above almost everything else. The transformation worked because it was complete. Marie Laveau, the former slave, ceased to exist, replaced by Marie Laveau, the conjure woman who could cure heartbreak, predict the future, and protect her clients from enemies both natural and supernatural. She established herself in a small cottage in the Treme neighborhood, where her reputation grew through whispered recommendations and miraculous successes. But the most powerful magic she practiced was the art of making herself indispensable to the very people who might otherwise betray her. White society matrons sought her love potions and hexes against romantic rivals. Free-colored families wanted protection from slave catchers and false accusations. Even enslaved people, when they could manage it, came seeking remedies for their impossible situations. Within 2 years, Marie Laveau had become such an integral part of New Orleans society that questioning her origins would have threatened the comfort of too many powerful people. She had achieved something unprecedented: freedom protected by her own carefully constructed necessity. Meanwhile, the legend of Amara of Vicksburg continued to grow in whispered conversations across the Mississippi River Valley. Some said she had died fighting militiamen in the Yazoo swamps. Others claimed she had escaped to Canada via the Underground Railroad. A few insisted she had transformed into a river spirit that haunted plantation owners' dreams with visions of burning mansions and poisoned tea. All of these stories contained fragments of truth, but none captured the complete reality. The 16-year-old kitchen servant who had poisoned her mistress and led a midnight revolt had indeed died not from bullets or bloodhounds, but from her own successful transformation into someone the world could accept as free. The morning mist rose from the Mississippi like the spirits of the restless dead, carrying whispers of a name that plantation owners still feared to speak aloud 25 years after the uprising. In New Orleans, parlors and slave quarters alike, they still told stories of Amara of Vicksburg. But the woman who had inspired those legends was serving café au lait to white society matrons who had no idea they were taking refreshment with the most wanted fugitive in Southern history. The cottage on Ursuline Street had become the unofficial headquarters of New Orleans' supernatural underground, where Marie Laveau dispensed advice, potions, and protection with equal expertise. The room smelled of burning sage and mystical possibilities, while Spanish moss draped from the ceiling created intimate alcoves where secrets could be shared without fear of oversight. Candles flickered against mirrors that reflected not just faces, but the careful performance of a woman who had learned to hide her true identity behind layers of constructed mythology. The morning's first client was Mrs. Evangeline Sinclair, whose husband owned 3 plantations in Louisiana and whose nightmares had been troubled by dreams of burning cotton fields and poisoned dinner parties. She clutched her coffee cup with hands that trembled despite the July heat, her eyes darting toward shadows as if expecting vengeful spirits to materialize from the humid air. "The dreams are getting worse, Mrs." Sinclair whispered. "I see fire, Marie. I see my servants watching me with eyes that hold secrets. What if what happened at Vicksburg? What if it spreads?" From the New Orleans Daily Picayune, August 15th, 1882. The legendary voodoo priestess Marie Laveau continues to attract clients from across the South, her reputation for spiritual protection unmatched in the Crescent City's supernatural community. Marie, formerly Amara, nodded with the practiced sympathy of someone who understood both the source of these fears and their justification. She had spent 25 years building a reputation that protected her from the very people who still sought the fugitive slave from Warren County. Her clients saw her as mystical, exotic, safely removed from the political realities that governed their world. They never suspected that their spiritual advisor was living proof that their deepest fears were entirely rational. "Your dreams speak truth," Marie replied, her voice carrying the authority that had made her the most sought-after conjure woman in Louisiana. "The spirits of the oppressed do not rest easy. They whisper warnings to those who have eyes to see and ears to hear." The irony was exquisite. White plantation owners paid Marie substantial sums for protection against the very kind of rebellion she had once led. They sought charms to ensure their slaves remained loyal, potions to detect poison in their food, and rituals to ward off the kind of organized resistance that had destroyed the Beaumont estate. In serving these clients, Marie gathered intelligence about plantation security, overseer rotations, and the movements of slave-hunting expeditions, information she quietly shared with the Underground Railroad operators who helped other fugitives reach freedom. But her most important work happened in the shadows, where escaped slaves and free colored people sought her assistance with practical magic. Forged papers that could withstand inspection, new identities backed by constructed histories, and the kind of social camouflage that allowed people to vanish from one life and emerge safely in another. The network she had built operated through whispered recommendations and coded conversations. A seamstress who needed new papers for her fugitive brother would mention needing special fabric for a delicate project. A free-colored merchant seeking to hide escaped slaves would inquire about protection charms for unexpected visitors. Marie's cottage became a way station where identities could be shed like old clothes and new lives. Purchased with careful planning and strategic bribes, 25 years of freedom built on borrowed time. The most dangerous moment came in 1881 when a former slave catcher named Jeremiah Hayes arrived in New Orleans with a collection of old wanted posters and an obsession with cold cases. Hayes had been tracking the Vicksburg fugitives for decades, convinced that at least one had survived to reach the city. His investigation was methodical and patient, following leads that others had abandoned years earlier. Hayes had noticed something that escaped less observant hunters. The timing of Marie Laveau's emergence in New Orleans society corresponded exactly with the period when the Vicksburg fugitives would have reached the city. More troubling, several of his informants reported that the conjure woman seemed unusually knowledgeable about plantation security and showed particular interest in helping escaped slaves' interests that went beyond typical spiritual practices. The confrontation came on a humid August evening when Hayes appeared at Marie's cottage with questions that could not be deflected with mystical nonsense. He had brought photographs recovered from the Beaumont plantation ruins daguerreotypes of house servants that had somehow survived the fire. One image showed a young woman standing beside Mrs. Beaumont's tea service, her face partially obscured by shadow, but her posture unmistakably familiar. Interesting resemblance, Hayes observed, studying Marie's face with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades matching descriptions to rewards. Of course, a lot of colored women look alike to white folks. But you move like someone who grew up in a big house, know things about white folks' habits that most conjure women wouldn't. Marie maintained her composure with a skill developed through 25 years of performance. I serve many white families, she replied evenly. Their habits become predictable when you pay attention. Most people see only what they expect to see. The conversation continued for an hour, a careful dance between accusation and denial, while Marie calculated the distance to the loaded pistol hidden beneath her altar cloth. Hayes was dangerous because he was intelligent, patient, and motivated by something more than money. The professional pride of a hunter who had never allowed prey to escape permanently. But Hayes had made one crucial error. He had come alone, convinced that a middle-aged conjure woman posed no physical threat. He had forgotten that the 16-year-old girl who poisoned her mistress and led 40 people in armed rebellion had grown into a 41-year-old woman with 25 years' experience in survival. The poison was subtle, a few drops of oleander extract in the bourbon he accepted as hospitality. Hayes would die in his hotel room that night, apparently from natural causes, his investigation notes mysteriously vanishing before authorities could examine them. The last serious threat to Marie Laveau's constructed identity died with him, leaving her free to continue her dual existence as New Orleans' most celebrated spiritual advisor and the South's most successful fugitive. As the years passed, the legend of Amara of Vicksburg grew larger, while the woman who had inspired it aged into comfortable obscurity. White society remembered the uprising as a cautionary tale about the dangers of insufficient vigilance, while black communities preserved it as proof that resistance was possible even under impossible circumstances. Neither version captured the complete truth, that sometimes the greatest victory is not the dramatic gesture of rebellion, but the quiet persistence of simply refusing to be destroyed. Marie Laveau died in 1881, officially her funeral attended by hundreds of mourners who praised her spiritual gifts and charitable works. But some say that on misty mornings along the Mississippi, you can still see an elderly woman gathering herbs by the water's edge, her movements carrying the careful grace of someone who learned long ago that survival requires constant vigilance. The cottage on Ursuline Street still stands, now a tourist attraction where visitors come seeking traces of the legendary voodoo priestess. They never find what they're looking for, because the real magic was never in the potions or hexes. It was in the transformation of an enslaved girl named Amara into a free woman named Marie, a metamorphosis so complete that even death could not undo it. In the end, perhaps that was the most powerful conjure of all. The ability to disappear so thoroughly that you become invisible even to yourself, while the legend you leave behind ensures that your real story, the one about choosing freedom over safety, resistance over submission, continues to inspire others long after the woman who lived it has faded into myth. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.